Scott, thank you for such a generous introduction. And more than that, I would be welcome to Russia, but I might have a rather one-sided relationship with the security services there. Souvenirs of which will no doubt come back home with me on my devices. And that really illustrates how cybersecurity is today, and how it is that we're here to not just secure networks or make sure that devices work and are accessible to us, but we're here to protect the way of life. So I'll talk about a couple things. I'll talk about the evolution that's gotten us here, why security, and in particular security, the cybersecurity, assuring that our systems, databases, and digital services are confidential, their data integrity is maintained, and they are available and accessible as needed and to those who need them, has become a fundamental cost and inevitable part of living this very digital way of life. Because if you think about it, we go back in less than 20 years to a world where people had less than one connected device per person. You perhaps had your office computer, your home computer that many of us shared in the 90s and early 2000s. The world crossed the 2 connected devices per person threshold sometimes in 2014. And remember, this is at a time where less than half of the global population is connected. So that's when you start to have your smart toasters, your industrial control systems. For some reason, your baby monitor or a child's toothbrush could go online and let you know. But that also means that you have these incredibly dumb, insecure, fundamentally unsecurable devices that go online. And it's been estimated that by 2020, so just a few years from now, there's going to be 30 to 50 billion of connected devices. Now that ranges, of course, from your standard computer, desktop or laptop, where you're used to thinking of security. You log on, you have your passwords, you have your virus protection, and then whatever your corporate security guy does to it. To these, which are really smaller but incredibly powerful computers, to smart light bulbs, to home devices that don't really have security built into them. And Scott already mentioned the October 2016 Internet of Things attack wave. I really wouldn't call it anything else, which took internet effectively away from this part of the world for a number of hours because too many people used the default passwords on their home, mostly routers, but also other smart devices in the home. So those devices were taken over, and whilst every single one of them is a reasonably harmless, reasonably non-powerful in terms of computing power device, altogether they swamped the biggest providers of the domain name system services. So the services that route our traffic on the internet, that translate the website address that you type in into where the traffic actually needs to go. Though they swamped those servers and took availability of internet down for this part of the world for a best part of the day. So it really highlighted how vulnerable we are and how we have to consider all 3 prongs of what's called the CIA triad. Again, the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information, databases, and systems. And it also made Estonia go, aha, well, told you so. And told you so more than a decade ago. The reason why we talk about Estonia in the context of cybersecurity is that in many ways, as a nation state, we were the canary in a coal mine. In spring 2007, Estonia was victim of the largest distributed denial of service attack that was coordinated at an unprecedented level, that demonstrated a number of things. First of all, it demonstrated again how incredibly reliant we are on this connected world. But this isn't reliance in terms of fundamental security. more important, it's a reliance in terms of being able to live the way of life, the lifestyle we've chosen, which is so digitally dependent. It also demonstrated how incredibly integrated cyber defense is into how we should defend and how we should see defense of a nation during peacetime, even more than during war. And what happened in Estonia was that in the lead up to the 2007 March parliamentary elections, a Soviet war monument, a highly contested, obviously quite emotional issue in my part of the world, became one of the central topics of the campaign. Something that for a large part of the population, rightfully so, symbolizes a Soviet occupation, forceful incorporation into a form of government we weren't particularly fond of and still aren't. No, a form of government that had either killed or deported everyone's grandparents. But also a symbol that for a large part of the population and for a large part of the political culture directly to the east of Estonia symbolizes the great victory of the Great Patriotic War. So, and also clearly another sign of how digitally dependent we are. So moving off a statue to a much better place, a memorial was to be moved to a military cemetery, became a highly contested political issue where Russia did what Russia is best at. Again, a non-attributed nation state that is to the east of Estonia. It ran information operations, it stirred up doubt, confusion, and unrest. You can see in the picture from the New York Times that there was large-scale protest by Estonian standards. No, the sort of crowd that you'd see after a college football game on this campus every time. But by Estonian standards, a large crowd that then also led to these cyber attacks. Relatively unsophisticated at first, but later coordinated, that were all against just availability. They took down banking for a few hours at the time over the course of a few weeks. They made working in the media, which is the industry I was in at the time, incredibly hard because, again, connectivity was unreliable. But they really showed what we've seen in the past decade, that when you're under this sort of attack, you have to try to change the slides. Can you click next for me? And also have the content of the slides, which seem to have disappeared. I'm sorry about that. For Estonia, a small nation state of 1.4 million people, a neighborhood in a major city in this country, it demonstrated how openly we have to communicate, because the cyber world is borderless and you can't just do perimeter defense. You have to cooperate across national boundaries, which hurried up the establishing of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. It also showed, most convincingly so far, that nation states will use cyberspace to assert their power, and not in a cyber war sense, but in a peacetime disrupting your way of life kind of sense. Because once you're at the threshold of an armed attack or at the threshold of use of force, the victim would get certain rights under international law of self-defense, of responses. But when you don't cross that threshold, you're making the life of the victim incredibly inconvenient, which in the end might affect their internal politics. The USA Democratic National Convention had been one of those cases. But it also highlighted, why I don't have text on this, the Estonian way of life. You mentioned an environment, but the ecosystem. And we truly are an ecosystem where using this little guy, that I believe a couple extra people in the audience also have, the Estonian ID card, which on the back has a chip and pin solution. The card carries my private key that should only be on this chip. And then the public key is known, so once I know the PIN code, I can access system, authenticate myself, but also sign with the power of a legally binding signature. I can access government services, a whole bunch of private sector services, banking, for example. 95% of taxes are declared online, again in this ecosystem. Only 1 in 50 medical prescriptions are done on paper, which is incredibly convenient because of, amongst other things, doctors' handwriting. Much safer this way. And for the last 3 elections, 1/3 of votes have been cast online. And when Estonians talk about i-voting, we mean voting online through a secure internet-connected computer using a specific voting app. We don't mean any of those scary black box kiosk technologies because of rail. And all in all, an estimated 2 to 6%, depending on whom you talk to, of GDP has been saved during this. However, it's important to note that in taking this ecosystem view, those of you who have a natural sciences background understand that you can't introduce something new to an ecosystem at the cost of the existing species solutions balance. And Estonia very much has taken the view where we see everything that's digital and electronic as an enhancement of what we have. You can still vote on paper. You can still vote early on paper. You can still have the ballot box brought to your home, your care institution, or in some cases your prison. But you also can, during the early voting period, cast your vote online in a way that's very secure. And there are 2 fundamental facilitators to that ecosystem. One of them is the ID card, a way with my government's warranty to say the person who has this card that bears this private key on the chip and has the PIN codes is the person whose public key is this. You know, we vouch for this person the same way we vouch for this person presenting this piece of plastic with all the seals and holograms and everything. And of course, you know, if you give away your PIN code, that's like teaching someone to do your signature. That's just bad hygiene. And secondly, a secure data exchange layer which allows the different databases and services to talk to each other and pull the information appropriate for them, which means as a citizen, I only ever have to give any information to my government once, and they figured out a way of securely exchanging that and only storing it in one place so that it's not duplicated and therefore it can't be contradictory or out of date. In theory, that sounds good, but then let's now look at what happens in real life. From last year, one of the biggest cyber attacks that had a large effect on economies, societies, and political systems, WannaCry, the ransomware from May last year, that amongst other things took down 1/3 of the British healthcare system, the NHS, Renault factories across Europe, Telefonica, the Spanish cell phone provider. Estonia had 0 victims. A large part of it is luck, but the large part of it is also how we manage risks. And the luck comes from preparation in risk management. We had 0 victims for 2 reasons. One of them was that this particular vulnerability that this ransomware took advantage of was tied to Windows XP. Now, Windows XP stopped receiving security patches in 2014, which is, for those who are mathematically challenged, which appears to be a large part of European political establishment, 3 years, full 3 years before this happened. This was a disaster waiting to happen for 1,000 days. Estonia, however, realizing that XP is no longer supported, you cannot patch your systems, decided to phase it out quickly, phased it out across government, and did a whole lot of awareness raising, including a program where if you went to the main news portals on a computer that was running on XP, you'd get a pop-up telling you, dude, really? Or maybe in more elegant language. But that meant that we'd managed to cut the use of XP in half in less than 1 year. And secondly, when auditing hospitals And this is where really these attacks had the biggest impact. Taking medical information for ransom, and the ways to unlock went reliable, was that in auditing medical systems and taking an ecosystem view, my colleagues very quickly realized that hospitals are not in the business of information assurance, information security, or anything else like that. But instead, they're in the business of saving lives, bettering health. And hospital managers are not equipped to deal really with the cybersecurity challenges. So instead of compliance and punishment, we'd spent a year, fortunately 18 months before this attack wave, we'd spent a year on educating hospitals and their heads of information security. And that really paid off, that and blood. Then Petya, not Petya, June this year, the wiper that was most likely nation state backed against another nation state, because if you look at the spread map, Crimea is where the most of the red dots are. Could be a coincidence, always could be. Estonia had about half a dozen victims, all of which, because it took advantage of a vulnerability in accounting software, all of which were targeted or fell victim through their corporate accounting systems outside of Estonia. Which brings us to the reality of international relations. Again, states will assert power, states will meddle with each other, and very few things are taboo. In international law, certain uses of force are taboo. Certain civilian targets are taboo even during armed conflict. What we've seen is that the fundamental functioning of a democracy no longer is taboo in terms of these politically or potentially politically motivated cyber attacks that operate in the gray area of inconvenience during peacetime rather than armed attack, when you could deploy a much higher measure of self-defense. Similarly, the attacks against Ukrainian power grid, Christmas Day 2015 and 2016, large parts of the areas around Kiev went dark. And they went dark because in what presumably was a display of power, not the full deployment of capabilities. Someone took over the power grid controls, and someone disabled even the manual override switches, so that the operators of that power grid could do nothing but look at the city go dark, block by block by block, and their screens becoming incomprehensible to the people trained to operate them. And that's really what we need to consider, and that's the one takeaway from what I want you to take home from today, is that no system is 100% secure 100% of the time. It's not that the risks in this digital world are higher, they're bigger, but they are different, and we need to design our digital systems with that sort of security by design in mind, because security as an afterthought is just a lot more expensive. The convenience of buying your voting machines as a black box solution where, as a consumer, as the client, you don't really understand what's going on inside of that, is incredibly convenient. But as the death on voting hacks, as the actual attacks against, most notably, VR systems, the provider of the voting registration solutions in a number of the states of these United States probe, it might be slightly short-sighted. So the Estonian way is, again, using this guy. As a backup, I also have a crypto SIM card in this guy as a backup, which carries the same warranty. And it is a specific crypto SIM card that does that most of power users, or most of what you would consider power users, have. So looking at that, we know that, and relying on that system. I mean, Estonia really can only have iVoting because we have that incredibly diverse ecosystem. People learn to trust it using banking services and similar. because you vote only once every 1 or 2 years, even if you vote at all of your elections. We found that voters have become average voters. In the last 3 sets of elections, they plateaued at 1/3 of voters just deciding to cast their vote online as a matter of convenience. And they're not statistically different from an average voter in terms of education, gender, any of that, even computer literacy. The only factor predicting voting online is whether your round trip to the polling station is more than half an hour, which makes sense. But in that system, the ID card, again, is a facilitator, but also the only key live dependency. Voter rolls get pulled from the population registry, but they get pulled as the voter rolls close, which is 30 days before elections, and then you have several weeks to lift the database. It stops being a live dependency. But ID card, you need to authenticate yourself to the system, and then, because the system mimics the postal double envelope voting system, where you have an inner envelope that's blank and an outer envelope that has your voter information, you sign the outer envelope digitally. You need to have the ID card accessible at all times. So we get to late August into a what could possibly go wrong world in Estonia. And what went wrong? It's one of the days where everyone knows who they were who works in my sector. I myself had just entered the Vatican Museum in Rome on a romantic city break and very quickly started to figure out how to get onto a reasonably secure line to Tallinn after that. Because we got notification from an international group of researchers on the late evening of August 30th, notifying us of a global flaw in the RSA cryptographic library in the firmware of this guy that globally affected 1 billion chips. But 750,000 of those were inside of the Estonian ID cards. About 2/3 of or 60% of the ID cards issued and currently valid. The same chip and the same crypto library is used in computers, in cell phones, by large tech giants and several governments. But Estonia is the only place where it's one of the foundations of such a diverse ecosystem. What made it complicated is, and I apologize for a quick introduction to technology lecture here, is that this guy has 3 layers of code on it. The first layer is what we call firmware, which is always put there by the manufacturer, which is the complicated mathematics allowing it to do what it does. And the firmware includes the cryptographic libraries, what the security is based on. Again, the complicated theoretical math that the security is based on. And there's a number of them on here. Then there's the operating system, which there's a few available, and Estonia had picked one. And only then the card application, which Estonia wrote. And the problem we discovered was 2 layers below our own work. It was in the firmware. So something we couldn't change, something that had been certified as international standard. So all we could do was to publicly communicate and to find a way to bypass the problem. What Estonia did differently from what the instincts of most governments still is what governments have learned to do well, and governments better than the private sector, in case of, again, ecological disasters. They let the population know. They let the population know 4 days after they receive notification themselves, in early September, with the Prime Minister, the Minister of Communications, the head of police, and my general director. And that allowed us to cut off any speculation, like you would want in a natural disaster. Whilst it's still only a theoretical vulnerability, there hadn't been and there hasn't been a proven way to take advantage of it. But it creates a theoretical risk of identity theft because the vulnerability is such that generating your private key becomes easier, not easy, but easier than what we'd like. And what we were able to do after having bypassed the panic and public speculation stage, because we communicated so openly, is to find a way to pass the flaw, to redirect the identity on this guy to a different crypto library, which by design was here. So we just asked the application layer to regenerate the private key. And it regenerated it on here, so it couldn't be stolen in transit. Because after all, this chip is a really slow and rather dull computing device. Estonia had built into its system something that's unique, which is an ability to suspend the keys rather than to revoke. Because if they're suspended, you can renew them remotely. If they're revoked, they're revoked, they're revoked. And that allowed us to regenerate, once we had the fix, to regenerate the keys. So all in all, what we learned is that cyber is integrated, that there's never 100% security 100% of time, but rather the key, just like in an ecosystem in the natural world, is to build resilience, to have these measures that we call security by design, because that's the only way to still have and facilitate this incredibly digital, dependent way of life that allows us to run our companies, societies, and political systems the way we want to run them and the way that's convenient to us as citizens. And, also it allows us to do what we value most, which by no means is critical to a society in terms of essential services, to be entertained, to be in touch, and to go about our lives the way we choose. So that's why cybersecurity matters, and that's why we need to take an ecosystem view.